The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day the bank sent its second notice, and Caleb Dre read both of them at the kitchen table without getting up for coffee or lighting the lamp, even as the evening came in through the window and the room went slowly dark around him. The bank notice said what he already knew: 30 days. The debt his father had left behind, the money borrowed against the Dre land before the old man's hands gave out and his judgment followed, had come due in a way that could not be deferred again. 30 days to show solvency, to show a functioning operation, to show the kind of stable household a creditor could trust. The loan officer, a man named Ferris who wore his collar too tight and smiled when he didn't mean it, had said as much in person 3 weeks prior. A ranch running at full capacity, a man of settled means, a household in order. That was the language Ferris had used, a household in order. As if the 60 acres and the cattle and the fence lines that Caleb had spent 11 years repairing and the well he'd dug himself in the summer heat meant nothing at all without a woman at the kitchen table. The second letter was from a woman named Eleanor Marsh. She had responded to the advertisement Caleb had placed through a correspondence agency in the city, the kind of arrangement that was more common than people admitted and more practical than people liked to say. He had written the advertisement himself at the same table on a night not unlike this one, choosing his words with the care he usually gave to fence wire and load-bearing posts. He had described the land honestly. He had described the work honestly. He had said he was 34 and solvent, and that he was not looking for anything other than a lawful arrangement between two practical adults who understood the terms. He had not said he was lonely. He had not said the house felt wrong at night. He had not said that he still sometimes set 2 cups out of habit and then put one back. Eleanor Marsh's letter was 3 pages long, written in a hand so precise, and even it looked almost printed. She said she was 29. She said she had experience managing accounts and knew the difference between red clover and alfalfa. She said she could cook, preserve, and tend a kitchen garden, and that she had no family in the region who would make demands on her time. She said she had read his advertisement twice and found it honest, which she valued more than warmth. She asked 2 questions at the end: how far the nearest town was and whether there was a room with a door that locked. Caleb read that last question 3 times. He wrote back the same night and told her the truth: 12 miles to town. And yes, there was a room with a door that locked, and he would not ask why she wanted it. If you've found this story, stay until the end. It earns it. She arrived on the first Thursday of April, on the afternoon stage from the rail depot, carrying one large trunk and a smaller case that she held herself and did not set down. Caleb was waiting at the post stop with the wagon. He recognized her before she spoke because she was the only passenger who stepped off the stage looking at the land before she looked at the people. She took in the sky, the flat line of the mesa, the dry pale color of the early spring grass, and something in her face shifted slightly, not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. "Mr. Dre," she said, "Miss Marsh." She looked at him directly, the way a person looks when they are assessing rather than greeting. He did not mind this. He did the same. She was not what he had constructed from the letter, which had been businesslike and contained. She was composed in the way that suggested effort rather than ease, a composure that sat slightly forward in her body, like a person who had learned to hold still in situations that once required running. Her eyes were gray and careful. She had dressed practically, which he noted and respected. She sat beside him on the wagon bench on the ride back without speaking for the first 10 minutes, watching the land pass, and he did not fill the silence. He had never been comfortable filling silence just to prove it could be filled. They drove through the gap between the 2 limestone ridges where the road narrowed, and the late afternoon light came through at an angle that made everything look briefly golden. The dry grass, the stones, the pale dust rising from the wagon wheels, and she said almost to herself, "It's larger than I thought." He wasn't sure if she meant the land or the sky or the space between things. He said it takes getting used to. She said, I expect most things do. He showed her the house that evening before supper. It was not a grand house. He had built most of it himself over 7 years, adding the east room and the covered porch as the cattle numbers improved, and there were places where you could see the evidence of learning, slightly uneven planks in the hallway floor, a window frame on the north side that sat a quarter-inch out of true. But it was solid. The roof did not leak. The cellar held. The kitchen was larger than it needed to be because he had built it imagining something he hadn't yet said aloud. He showed her the room at the end of the hall. It had a window facing east, a narrow bed with a decent mattress, a washstand, and a hook on the back of the door. The lock, he said, and pointed to the bolt. New iron installed the week before. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set the smaller case down for the first time since stepping off the stage, and something in the set of her shoulders changed just slightly, the way a person exhales when they have been holding their breath for a long time without quite knowing it. Thank you, she said. It was the first time she had said those 2 words to him, and they sounded, he thought, like they meant more than gratitude. They were married at the county office on a Friday morning, with old Pete Garland from the neighboring spread and Pete's wife Ruth Ann as witnesses. Pete had said very little about the arrangement when Caleb told him, which was Pete's way of saying he approved. Ruth Ann had said quite a lot, which was Ruth Ann's way of saying the same thing, though she wrapped it in concern and practical advice and the observation that a leaner had good hands. Working hands, Ruth Ann said, with the particular approval of a woman who had worked her own land for 30 years. Not soft, that tells you something. It tells me she works, Caleb said. That's what I said, Ruth Ann said, and left it there. The ceremony itself took 11 minutes. The magistrate read the requisite words. A leaner answered when asked to answer and signed where asked to sign. Caleb did the same. There was no particular feeling he could name when it was done, no surge of emotion that the occasion seemed to demand. What he felt instead was something quieter, a subtle shift in the structure of things, like a beam settling into a joint, not dramatic but permanent. They drove home without much conversation, but it was a different kind of silence than the first drive from the stage stop. That silence had been the silence of 2 strangers measuring each other. This one was the silence of 2 people beginning something they had not yet found words for. April gave way to May, and May brought the first real warmth of the season and the work that came with it. Caleb had expected to be explaining things, how the operation ran, which pastures were rotated when, how he managed the books, the particular temperament of the second well pump that required holding the handle at a slight angle. He had been prepared to instruct. A leaner did not require much instruction. She went through the household accounts the second week with the same methodical attention she gave to everything, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open, making small notations in the margin, asking questions that were direct and precisely targeted. She found an error in the feed vendor's billing that Caleb had missed for 3 months. She said nothing dramatic about it. She wrote a letter to the vendor, stated the discrepancy, and the corrected amount arrived in the next invoice. She planted the kitchen garden in the second week of May using seeds she had brought herself in a cloth bag at the bottom of the large trunk, sorted by type and labeled in her even handwriting. Caleb watched her from the fence one morning as she worked the soil and noticed that she knew what she was doing, the way she turned the earth, checked the drainage, set the rows with a practical spacing that showed she was thinking about yield, not appearance. He brought her water without being asked. She looked up when he set it down beside her and she almost smiled, not quite, but almost. They had an arrangement and they both understood it. They were not pretending to be something they weren't. But something was happening in the house, incremental and unannounced, the way warmth enters a room slowly from a fire that has been going for a while. He started setting 2 cups out again in the morning without thinking about it. She started leaving the kitchen lamp on when she knew he would be coming in late from the pasture. Small things, domestic things, the kind that accumulate without ceremony until one day you realize they have built something. Caleb would not let himself name what it was. He was a practical man, and this was a practical arrangement, and he was not going to construct something out of his own wanting that might not exist. But he noticed things. He noticed that she read in the evenings with a particular quality of stillness, fully absorbed, gone somewhere else while staying entirely present. He noticed she ate with pleasure and without apology. He noticed that when the spring storms came through and the thunder cracked hard over the mesa, she stood at the kitchen window and watched instead of retreating, her arms folded, her expression steady, almost approving of the violence in the sky. He noticed the small case. She had put it in her room and she had never opened it in his presence. He had seen it on the high shelf above the washstand through the open door once when she was outside. It was worn leather with a brass latch that looked like it had been opened many times. He did not ask about it. He had told her he would not ask why she wanted a lock, and a man who meant that had to mean more of it than just the door. It was Pete Garland who first said the name. He came by in the middle of May on a pretext about a fence survey, which was a real enough errand but not the reason he stayed for 40 minutes at the kitchen table while Alina was in the garden. Pete had the particular look of a man who was working up to something, rotating his hat brim slowly in his hands, taking his time with his coffee. "There's a fellow been asking," Pete said finally. Caleb looked at him. "In town. Is asking about your wife, where she came from, how long you'd known her before the marriage." Pete set the hat on the table. Name he gave was Croft, said he was from the eastern counties, didn't say what business. Caleb kept his face still. "What did you tell him?" "Told him I didn't know more than a neighbor's business to know." Pete paused. But Caleb, he knew her name before he said it, her full name, Alina Grace Marsh, said it like he'd practiced it. After Pete left, Caleb stayed at the table for a while. Then he went out to where Alina was working the second row of the garden, crouching with a hand trowel, her back to him. He said, "There's a man in town asking about you." She went still. Her hand stopped moving. The stillness was different from her usual composure. It had a held quality like a breath. She did not turn around immediately. When she did, her face was controlled in a way that he recognized as the effort kind, not the easy kind. "Did he give a name?" she asked. "Croft." Something passed through her eyes that was not quite fear and not quite anger. "It was something older than either," she said. "He found me faster than I expected." Caleb waited. She looked at him for a long moment, measuring something. Then she stood and brushed the soil from her hands and said, "I need to tell you something. I should have told you before we married. I want you to understand that I knew that and I did it anyway, and I don't have a defense for it that holds up." He said, "All right." "The room," she said, "and the lock, that wasn't just a preference." He said, "I figured that." She told him, standing in the garden with the afternoon light coming flat and bright off the limestone ridges and the smell of turned earth between them. She told him the way people tell things they have rehearsed for a long time in their own minds, evenly, without decoration, watching his face. Her father had died 4 years prior and left an estate that was not large but was not nothing, a small property in the eastern counties, some savings, a share in a flour concern that turned a modest profit. He had left it to Alina outright, which her father's brother had contested from the day of the reading. The uncle's name was Gerald Croft. He had hired lawyers, filed motions, delayed the estate's settlement in court for 2 years. When that failed, he had tried another approach. He had found a man willing to sign a document claiming Alina owed a debt from a transaction that had never happened, a fabricated commercial obligation large enough to place a lien on the inheritance. The document was fraudulent. Alina had known it and had said so loudly to anyone who would listen. But Gerald Croft had money and connections and patience, and Alina had spent a year watching a lie be treated as a question worth investigating. She had left, not running. She had made clear she intended to return with the matter settled. She had contacted the correspondence agency because she needed distance, time to gather her own documentation, and because she had been honest with herself about something most people would not admit. A woman with a lawful household and a husband of settled means in a different county was considerably harder to harass through fabricated debt claims than a woman alone in a boarding house. "I needed the arrangement as much as you did," she said, "but I didn't tell you why. You told me your situation plainly and I didn't tell you mine." Caleb stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the garden row she'd been working. He said, "What's in the case?" She almost looked startled. Then she said, "My father's original will, notarized copies of the estate filing, letters from 2 witnesses to the meeting where Gerald offered the false transaction. A deposition from the man he hired who changed his account 18 months in." Caleb nodded slowly. "You've had the evidence to settle it," he said. "I've had most of it. I was waiting on one more document from a county clerk who had been stonewalled twice by Croft's lawyers. It was supposed to arrive within the month." Caleb's thought about a woman who carried her legal case in a locked bag and asked for a room with a bolt and still sat at the table reading with that quality of settled stillness, still tended a garden with that quality of care, still corrected the feed vendor's billing without being asked, still left the lamp on when he came home late. He said, "You were planning to go back and finish it." "Yes." "When the document arrived." "Yes." He looked at her. She was watching him with the kind of careful attention of a person who is prepared to accept a verdict they've already reasoned out, who knows the cost and has decided to meet it standing up. He said, "Then we wait for the document." She said, "Caleb, you corrected a 3-month billing error in your second week," he said. "You're telling me you can't close out an estate case when you have a signed deposition and an original will in a locked bag?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I didn't know how you'd take it," she said. "I'm taking it," he said, and turned back toward the barn. He was not unaffected. He spent the better part of that evening with the cattle and the familiar work of the evening check, moving through the routine because it was the kind of thing that let a man think without performing his thinking. He understood that she had withheld the truth. He understood why. He was not certain the why excused it, but he was also honest with himself about something, that the thing he was feeling most beneath the careful reasoning was not betrayal. It was something closer to recognition. She had come here with a problem she was managing and a plan she was executing and a wound she was not going to explain unless pressed. And she had worked the garden and corrected the accounts and left the lamp on and carried the whole of it without complaint and without asking anything from him that wasn't in the original terms. That was, he admitted in the dark of the barn, very nearly himself. Gerald Croft came to the ranch on a Saturday morning, which showed either boldness or poor judgment, and Caleb suspected both. He was not what the name had suggested. Caleb had expected something more imposing. What arrived was a man of perhaps 60, well-dressed for a ranch road, with the particular manner of someone who believed that authority was a costume you could put on and people would simply accept. He had a younger man with him who had the look of a hired lawyer, soft hands, and a document case. Eleanor was in the house. She had seen the wagon coming from the window and had come to find Caleb without hurrying, which told him something. She said, "He'll try to serve a notice, the fabricated debt filing." Caleb said, "Can he serve it here? He can serve it anywhere, it doesn't make it valid." "Then let him serve it." She looked at him. "You're not going to ask him to leave? A man can write up a road." "I'm more interested in whether your document has arrived." It had arrived, as it happened, 4 days prior. Eleanor had said nothing about it, which he understood now as the last of her waiting, wanting to see what shape things would take before she moved. Croft climbed down from the wagon and walked toward the porch with the confidence of a man who had won enough small confrontations to believe he would win this one. He looked at Caleb and then looked past him at Eleanor, and there was something in that look that Caleb filed away quietly and precisely, the look of a man who had once had a measure of control over someone and was not reconciled to having lost it. "Eleanor," Croft said, "You've caused a considerable amount of difficulty," she said. Gerald, just that, 2 syllables with nothing attached. Croft's lawyer opened the document case and produced a paper. Caleb took it when it was extended, read it once, and handed it to Alina. "She'll need a day to review it with our county council," Caleb said. "There's nothing to review, it's a valid debt instrument." "Then it'll still be valid after she's reviewed it," Caleb said. "You've ridden out here on a Saturday. I expect you can ride back." Croft looked at him with the particular calculation of a man reassessing an obstacle. "This arrangement," Croft said, with the faint emphasis that was meant to diminish it, "doesn't change her legal obligations." Caleb said no. "And her legal documentation doesn't change because you've driven out on a good road to hand her a piece of paper." There was a silence. Croft looked at Alina. Alina looked back at him with her gray eyes carrying nothing he could use. "You should have stayed in the eastern counties," Croft said to her. She said, "You should have respected the will." He left. The lawyer went first, then Croft, taking the steps off the porch with slightly less assurance than he'd arrived with. Caleb and Alina stood on the porch and watched the wagon go back down the road until it turned through the limestone gap and disappeared. He said, "You were ready," she said. "I've been ready for 2 years." He said, "I know." She turned and looked at him, and something in her face was different from every other expression he had catalogued in the weeks since April. It was not composure and it was not effort. It was something more open than either, a look that had set down the weight it had been carrying long enough to be seen without it. She said, "Thank you for staying on the porch." He said, "Where else would I be?" It was not a question. Alina wrote to the county council that afternoon, and within 3 weeks the fabricated debt instrument had been formally challenged and suspended pending review of the documentation in the case. The clerk's letter, the one she had waited for, contained a statement from the original filing notary, who had later come forward to confirm that the signature on the debt document was not Alina's, and that he had been approached about backdating the notarization. With that, the case collapsed the way poorly built things do, not with drama, but with the quiet inevitability of a structure that was never sound. Gerald Croft did not return. The inheritance settled. It was not a fortune, but it was enough, a solid addition to a ranch that had been stretching itself thin enough to cover the bank's requirement, to pay down the debt Caleb's father had left, to repair the north pasture fencing properly rather than provisionally. Ferris from the bank came out in June for a review visit, the kind where he walked the property with a ledger and a practiced frown that was meant to suggest he was harder to impress than he actually was. Caleb showed him the cattle numbers and the account books and the cleared debt statement. Alina sat at the kitchen table with the estate documentation spread in front of her, and answered Ferris's questions with the precise, patient attention of someone who had spent 2 years dealing with considerably more hostile interrogators. Ferris left with the satisfied look of a man who had discovered nothing wrong and was slightly put out by it. When his wagon was out of earshot, Pete Garland, who had come over that morning under the same fence survey pretext as before, said from the kitchen doorway, "That man has never once smiled and meant it." Alina said, "He smiled when he wrote the clearance." "Well," Pete said, "that one I'll allow." Summer came fully to the ranch, the long dry weight of it, the heat that gathered in the fields by 10 in the morning and held until past sundown, the way the light went hard and white at midday and then softened slowly into gold. Caleb and Alina moved through the work of it together, the irrigation checks, the hay cutting, the long evenings on the porch when the heat finally broke and the sky went deep blue above the mesa and the bats came out over the south pasture. They had not spoken directly about what the arrangement had become, which was a different thing now than it had been in April. But some things did not require speech. They had been said in other ways, in the lamp left burning, in the water brought to the garden, in 2 cups set out every morning as a matter of course, in a man standing on a porch without being asked because there was nowhere else he would have considered being. One evening in August late, with the last light fading off the limestone ridges and the smell of cut hay coming across the field, Alina came out to the porch and sat in the second chair, the one that had been empty before April, and she had the small case with her. She set it on the porch rail and looked at it for a moment, then she opened it. Caleb looked over. Inside were the documents exactly as she described: the will, the depositions, the clerk's letter, and beneath all of it a photograph, small and slightly faded, of a man who had the same gray eyes she had, sitting in a chair in front of a modest house, looking at the camera with an expression that was steady and undemonstrative and quietly proud. "My father," she said. He looked at the photograph for a while. "He looks like a man who knew what he had," Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He used to say that a piece of land wasn't worth anything on its own. That what made it worth something was the tending." Caleb said he was right. She looked at him then, and he looked at her, and the evening light was on everything: the porch, the chair, the old photograph, the case with its worn brass latch, the long grass of the south pasture moving slightly in the last of the day's wind. She closed the case and did not put it back on the shelf above the washstand. She left it on the table inside near the window where the morning light would come through and fall across it. He noticed this. He noticed, too, the next morning when she came to the kitchen and he had set 2 cups out already, and she poured coffee into both without comment. And they sat together in the early quiet with the light coming in and the day beginning the way days do when the people inside a house have decided, without needing to say so, that the house is theirs and the life inside it is something they have both chosen, not out of necessity anymore, but out of something quieter and more lasting than necessity. The document from the bank came in September, the final clearance, the confirmation that the Dre land was solvent and unencumbered and registered in good standing. Caleb held it for a minute at the kitchen table. Then he set it down next to the small leather case which was still there, which had not moved, which had become simply a part of the things that lived in the kitchen now. Alina came in from the garden, soil on her hands, and looked at the document. She said, "Settled then." He said, "Settled." She washed her hands at the basin. He folded the bank letter carefully and placed it inside the small case next to the photograph of her father with the gray eyes and the steady expression, and latched it closed. She didn't say anything about it, but she didn't move the case away. It sat on the table through the winter, through the first snow that came hard over the mesa in November and piled soft and white against the kitchen window and made the light inside seem warmer by contrast. It sat there when Pete and Ruth Ann came for supper, and Ruth Ann said that the garden had been the best in the county this year. And Pete said he supposed that was possible, and Ruth Ann said it wasn't a supposition, it was a fact. It sat there on the mornings when the cold came in under the door, and Caleb built the fire up, and Alina came to the kitchen still pulling her hair back. The two of them moving around each other in the small space with the ease of people who have learned the shape of each other's habits. Spring came back around as it does, and the first Thursday of April arrived again, 1 full year from the day a woman had stepped off the afternoon stage and looked at the sky before she looked at the people. Caleb went out to the porch that morning before the work started and stood in the early light, looking at the land, the same land he had looked at for 11 years, the same limestone ridges, the same pale grass beginning to green at the roots, the same sky going wide and blue above everything. The door opened behind him and Alina came out with 2 cups and handed him one without a word and stood beside him. The land was the same, everything else was different, not loudly, not dramatically, just in the way that things are different when what was once a hope has been lived into long enough that it no longer feels like hope. It feels like ground.